From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on them. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode,
in a way, the salt marsh sparrow really is kind of the canary in the coal mine in the sense of being an indicator species, because it's so sensitive to changes in sea level rise. It's kind of that bellwether bird. So you might say, well, we haven't noticed changes in the marsh, but of course we have noticed changes in the marsh. But even before you notice that, you can detect these birds declining, and that tells you that something's changing.
Something is changing indeed. Let me set the scene for you here. It's dawn. I've just driven down this lonely gravel road that feels like you're driving to the end of the earth. After you turn off the main road, there are a few houses hugging the roadside. Then the road becomes gravel, and you're bumping along past nothing but salt marsh for what seems like forever. It's one of those little roads that can only exist because some big, heavy machines scooped up a whole bunch of muck and piled it up, leaving behind a canal and roadbed running parallel to each other. At last, you come to a gravel parking lot and a boat ramp. Oh man, it's early. Woo!
Good morning.
Good morning. Is this what 5:30 looks like?
Beautiful.
Yeah. That's where I meet David Curson and Christina Olson. And they're not alone. Buzzing and colliding with our faces is a symphony of bugs. These include mayflies, the stinging scourge of the swamp. Oh, I'm already getting bitten.
Yeah, if you kind of stand in the wind, they don't bother you so much.
I'll take your word for it. All right, I'm going to go spray down.
Okay, no worries.
Olson is a biologist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Curson is the Maryland Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon Mid-Atlantic. They're still getting geared up when I arrive in the morning twilight. I wriggle into a pair of chest waders, which are like rubber boots that go all the way up to the middle of your torso. Great for keeping dry if you have to wade through water. Not so great for hiking. I would learn that the hard way. But right now, Curson is stuffing his backpack with the essentials. Binoculars, notebooks, a tank of water, and lastly, this old-school-looking MP3 player and an even older GPS device.
Yeah, this is a pretty old GPS. I've had it for 10 years. It's not the latest or most spiffy model, but it works, and it will get us to this point P2.
P2 is one of 6 reference points that Curson and Olson plan to visit today in the Deal Island Wildlife Management Area in Maryland. These are spots where they will conduct surveys for birds that inhabit the salt marsh. In a few months, a pipe will spew mud on top of this low-lying squiggle of land, raising the marsh's elevation by a little over a foot.
It's basically a new strategy that we really need to employ more widely if we're going to retain our tidal marshes in the Chesapeake Bay. Some models predict that all of today's tidal marshes in the Chesapeake Bay will have eroded and be inundated and lost by 2100. And if we want to keep them around, we need to be very proactive in our management of them.
To be sure, Curson cares about the marsh. He cares about all the birds that scratch out a living in this inhospitable environment. But today, his search is primarily dedicated to finding one bird species. It's called the salt marsh sparrow, and it is an unlikely candidate to be anyone's favorite bird. It's this tiny brown bird that looks like every brown bird you've ever seen. Its song, if you want to call it that, is a strained complaint, barely audible.
It's a really pathetic little lisp, something that it shouldn't be proud about, you know.
Why would the Army Corps go to so much trouble to import muck to what is certainly one of the loneliest corners of the eastern shore of Maryland? There are many reasons, it turns out, but one of the main ones is to help save this enigmatic little bird from disappearing. Because as the salt marsh sparrow goes, Kirsten tells me, so goes an entire ecosystem. When you come out to a place like this, and you don't see this bird and this habitat that was here in the past, is this climate change happening before our eyes?
It is. It's very much climate change. I mean, it's sea level rise that is, eroding the marshes and flooding the nests of salt marsh sparrows and causing their decline.
To get an accurate picture of the state of the sparrow in this landscape, you have to tromp out into it. Let's do it. During this season of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're examining climate change. It's happening in the here and now, and not just at the North Pole and Antarctica. We're talking right here in the Chesapeake Bay region.
Step.
With each episode, we're taking a close look at one slice of this new reality. Think of this as a snapshot in time before things get worse, when we as a society can maybe still change the future. Oh yeah, this is mucky. We're all familiar with the heartbreaking photographs of polar bears starving in the Arctic, but they're far from the only species being impacted by climate change. Many can be found right here in the Chesapeake Bay region. Today, we check in on just a handful of those organisms and what those changes mean for our world. We'll talk about that right after this short break.
Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you in part by Greenfin Studio, offering marketing and communications services for a greener world. Their team combines strategy, creativity, and scientific insight, setting them apart when conservation, sustainability, and scientific organizations need help telling their stories. See what they can do for you at greenfinstudio.com.
Welcome back. I could have called this episode Beyond Polar Bears because when it comes to climate change's impact on animals and insects, that's just the beginning of the story. Rising greenhouse gas emissions are warming the planet. While you and I may hardly notice the difference, other forms of life certainly do. That's the case with the salt marsh sparrow, but I get that the consequences of losing this species are a bit abstract. Other than ornithologists and birders, few people are aware of its steep decline. So, before we return to our marsh safari, I want to spend some time on a couple of creatures whose fates are, let's say, a little more intertwined with our own. Decades from now, are we heading toward a future where wild or even, or the farmed oysters just can't survive in the Chesapeake Bay?
I think that answer depends on us and what we decide to do about climate change and what actions we're going to take to address the root causes of climate change.
This is Emily Revest, an oyster researcher at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. She and her colleague, Marjorie Friedrichs, have just started an interesting study about the impact of climate change on Chesapeake oysters. It's hard to overstate the importance of oysters in the economies and cultures of Maryland and Virginia. In both states, oysters are scraped off the bottom or farmed in underwater cages. The industry generates tens of millions of dollars in dockside value annually. But the bivalves aren't just good for eating. They're filter feeders, helping to clean nutrients and sediment from the water. To improve the bay's water quality, the states have committed to restoring oyster reefs at 11 sites. Meanwhile, a coalition of government agencies and nonprofit partners have announced plans to plant 10 billion oysters in the bay by the year 2025. At first blush, oysters seem like they'd be pretty resilient to climate change. Sea level rise? Just more water to live in. Warmer waters? no problem there either. The oyster species that lives in the Chesapeake can be spotted as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. But it turns out that as we pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're altering the chemistry of the water. And oysters just can't handle that, Friedrich says.
As atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing, that is being absorbed by the oceans and by the estuaries, by Chesapeake Bay. And so the concentration of carbon dioxide in the surface waters is increasing, leading to acidification.
According to Revest, the increasing acidification represents a 1-2 punch against an oyster's health. Number one,
It affects the ability of the oysters to make their shell.
oysters, under normal conditions, grab the carbonate ions floating in the water around them to make new shell. But acid robs the water of those ions, forcing oysters to work harder to grow. Number two,
Is similar to if you pulled a human tooth and put it into a cup of soda and watched what happened over time. You would see that that tooth would start to dissolve. And the same thing happens with oyster shells under ocean acidification in Chesapeake Bay.
not that Chesapeake oysters need more problems. Already, the population is about 1% of its historic size from decades of overharvesting and aquatic disease. All shellfish are under threat from ocean acidification. We're talking crabs, clams, scallops, and more. The first wave of trouble from acidification has already lapped onto America's shores. A little over a decade ago, oyster larvae in the Pacific Northwest began dying in droves. Scientists there discovered that upwellings from deeper, more corrosive waters were making coastal waters too acidic for young oysters to survive. In the Chesapeake, I have some good news. Our oysters have an evolutionary advantage over their West Coast counterparts. Revest again.
Chesapeake Bay oysters are really resilient. They are very tolerant of extreme water conditions because they've evolved in this really dynamic coastal estuary. So a lot of the warning signs that came out of the larval crashes associated with acidification in the Pacific Northwest, those thresholds are not relevant to oysters in Chesapeake Bay. They can tolerate that low level of acidity and beyond.
So that buys researchers time to come up with solutions. Or maybe we'll just never hit that limit, that point of no return for the oyster industry. And that's the thing. We just don't know. Climate change is this unbelievably destructive experiment for just about all living things. How one species reacts may be completely different from another, even within the same genus. West Coast oysters and East Coast oysters. As Friedrichs put it,
we've learned a lot in the past 5 or 10 years about how acidification is going to be impacting oysters and what the future of acidification will be in the bay. But we're really only now beginning to put all these things together.
Earlier this year, the two researchers launched a 3-year, $1 million study to determine how acidification will impact the oyster industry. The work includes reconfiguring a computer model to show where and when the water will become too corrosive to support oyster growth in the Chesapeake. And researchers also will interview watermen and oyster farmers to learn how they might respond to the changes, Revest told me.
That even if the oysters are still surviving and they're still making a shell, they may not be doing well enough to make ends meet in the account ledger of these oyster farmers.
Let's see how another species in the Chesapeake region is already reacting to climate change. It's in a class of organisms that, frankly, we humans just don't like all that much.
This is a really big problem. A lot of pest species are moving, farther and farther north because they've just been held in check by the winter temperatures. As soon as it gets warmer, there they go, as long as there's habitat for them.
Sarah Vaya, you may recall from previous episodes, is a climate extension specialist with the University of Maryland. a parade of new pests is marching its way up from the tropics into the mid-Atlantic and beyond. For example, fire ants, once only found in the deep south, have made their way into Virginia in recent years. I grew up with them in South Florida, and I can tell you their sting does indeed feel like fire. Another species of concern is the southern pine beetle.
Little tiny beetles that attack pine trees.
The beetles have been known to wipe out whole forests of loblolly pines, at one point costing the timber industry $100 million a year.
And they burrow under the bark, and they lay their eggs underneath there. And then the larvae just sort of cruise around under the bark, chewing up the layer, the all-important layer of tissue where the water is going up to the leaves and the sugars are coming down to the roots. And they chew through that and effectively kill the trees.
They were unknown in the mid-Atlantic until a couple decades ago.
But then winter started warming up, and pine beetles started to be able to overwinter farther and farther and farther north. And so that's what's been happening over the last few decades, is they've been, the northern front of the southern pine beetle has been moving farther northwards. And they have caused trouble in Maryland on the eastern shore and in pine plantations over there. And now the southern pine beetle has moved through Maryland into New Jersey, Connecticut, up along the coast, all the way almost to Nova Scotia.
One study found you can actually track the migration with the increase in temperature. The minimum threshold for beetles is 14 degrees inside a tree's bark. The 14-degree threshold has been drifting northward at a rate of 40 miles per decade. According to the Columbia University study, the sightings of pine beetles, meanwhile, have been heading north at 53 miles per decade. A pretty good match. Southern pine beetles aren't the only new pest on the Chesapeake region's radar. For our next example, I ventured into a shadowy forest on Virginia's eastern shore. But truth be told, I could have gone just about anywhere within the watershed to find what I was looking for.
Did you get something? Alright, so this is a larval bomb. Little tiny larval bomb? Yeah. So those are all ticks. There's probably about 50 of them right there. They're all about the size of a period and size 12 font.
Yeah, it looks like a bunch of ground pepper.
Yeah, exactly. So all of those guys can bite you. Good news is they're the least likely to have pathogens. And Tori's going to use a piece of blue tape here to get them off, because picking them off with tweezers will take a while.
I know what you're thinking. I get all the best assignments, don't I? Holly Gaff is the picture of what you'd hope a tick scientist would be. Funny, self-effacing. She's wearing this bright orange homemade shirt that bears on its front the initials of her school, Old Dominion University. But the O is in the shape of a tick. On the back is a tick research bingo game. Instead of numbers, the squares are labeled with oddly specific life episodes, like picked tick off roadkill and got lost on the way to the field site. The shirts are good for public outreach, she says.
We get a lot of traction when we go into gas stations and other places, and people, once they stop thinking we're complete nutbags, which of course we are, we can get a lot of traction talking to the public.
Gaff and her graduate student, Tori Rose, are hunting for ticks on the pine needle-strewn bed of a forest just a few dozen yards away from one of the Nature Conservancy's office buildings. Now, think about what you'd do if it was your job to collect ticks in the wild. How would you do it? If you're picturing someone rolling around on the forest floor until they got covered in tiny black dots, you wouldn't be that far off. So you guys look like you're ready to surrender.
Exactly. We have 1 meter by 1 meter white flags. White is just convenient because you can see the ticks, and then drag it along the ground and through the vegetation, and then ticks will grab onto pretty much anything that's moving. And then they're also looking for carbon dioxide, which we breathe out conveniently, and then shadow changes, and so the cloth going over top of them will activate them to grab onto whatever's moving, and then we look on the flag, pick them off that, put them in a vial, and take them back to the lab to figure out what they are.
Gaff and Rose tiptoe forward, swabbing the ground in front of them with their white flags in slow, even strokes. When the flag comes up with a dense cluster of black flecks on it, they know they've found a throng of young ticks, what Gaff calls a larvae bomb. This forest during this time of year just happens to be crawling with baby Lone Star ticks. A few minutes after Rose captured her first bomb, Gaff dabs up another.
Got 2 big smudges there.
Yep, so that'll be... So they've all come up looking for food, and now I have them all over my flag.
I may never go out into nature again.
You know, it is amazing what you don't realize is under your feet. Right?
Gaff says she hardly ever gets bitten, maybe once every other year. She chalks up her success to mopping up any would-be biters with her flag and spraying down with lots of permethrin. Since Gaff started her surveys 12 years ago, she and her team have collected 280,000 ticks, she estimates. The goal is to get a count of ticks at select sites on both sides of the bay. Then, after time, see what patterns have emerged.
Really trying to understand the long-term dynamics, the ebbs and flows of these tick populations. Some years we get a lot of them, and some years we don't. And I have no idea why yet. I've been trying to figure that out but again, these larvae, if they successfully feed, will be a nymph next year, and then an adult the following year. So that kind of long-term dynamic change, we have hurricanes that come, right? We have winter sometimes, we don't have winter other times, we have hot summers, we have dry summers, and so how those add up to the 2 or 3 year life history of a tick is still something we're trying to figure out.
One thing, though, is abundantly clear. Certain tick species are migrating northward into the Chesapeake region because of climate change. First came the Lone Star ticks. 30 or 40 years ago, if Gaff had been here with her science flag, there would have been no Lone Stars stuck to it.
Now they're all the way up into Maine. So they're definitely the most likely tick you are to find on the shore, anywhere on the peninsula, eastern shore. 95% of what we collect are these guys.
You said something I did not know. I thought Lone Star ticks had been here forever.
No, so my predecessor, Dr. Dan Sonnenschein at Old Dominion, actually studied their invasion during the 70s and 80s. And so he watched their range expansion during that time frame. Originally started out and only had dog ticks, and then the Lone Stars came in after that. So it's been interesting, 30, 40 years later to watch other range expansions.
The Lone Star invasion didn't start with climate change. With the help of strict hunting regulations, deer populations came roaring back in the 70s and 80s. That provided plenty of tick food for Lone Stars. Reforestation efforts in the north also helped lure the species up from the south. Their migrations stopped around Maryland, though, because winters were too cold to push any farther north. Now, warming temperatures have helped them to restart their journey.
Okay.
Yep, it paused for a bit in the 90s, and in the last 10 years it's just kind of exploded.
What enables ticks to survive farther north has less to do with the temperature of the air than its water content, Gaff tells me. Ticks will die from a lack of water long before they die from the cold. It's why the Centers for Disease Control recommends that you toss your clothes in the dryer if you believe you've been around ticks. The dry air kills them. Under Gaff's watch, she says, 2 more tick species are establishing a foothold in Virginia and beyond.
We've been watching a couple tick species doing what we call range expansion or an invasion. So we first found them in North Carolina, we watched them march across Virginia, and now they've moved up beyond us into Maryland and beyond.
Just in this last 12 years?
Yeah, so we've watched 2 different species move north in these last 12 years.
What are they?
So the main one that people would care about is, they should care about both actually, but one is a human biter called Gulf Coast tick, and it's a large, very aggressive tick. A couple populations in Maryland I've heard about now, all the way up to Jersey. New York City had their first population this year.
What's the other one?
It's called Ixodes affidus. It does not have a common name. It's not a human biter, but it can amplify the pathogen that causes Lyme disease in the black-legged ticks, so some spillover concerns with it bites all the animals become positive, and then more of our human biters become positive is one of our theories. And we've seen that a little bit, but up on the eastern shore of Maryland, it hasn't moved. This is about as far north as it's gotten, and it seems to have stopped here.
This is all happening at a time when reports of Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases are surging in the mid-Atlantic. You can start to see why Gaff has perfected the art of gallows humor.
Well, all tick-borne diseases are such a slow-motion epidemiological pandemic, that it makes it tough for people to get behind.
And here you are out here with no funding.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're that scientist at the beginning of the disaster movie.
Exactly. No, I will fully say, there's plenty of other folks that are doing it in other parts of the country, and the Lyme advocates have really been rallying cry for this kind of funding for decades with no traction. We have mosquito control districts, but we don't have tick control districts, right? We don't even know how many ticks we have in most parts of the U.S.
Gaff is here to monitor and record this chapter of society's climate change story. Back on the Maryland side of the same peninsula, David Curson is doing the same thing, but the species at the center of his investigation isn't benefiting from the change. It's losing and disappearing. Curson is searching, straining to see or hear any evidence of a salt marsh sparrow in the squishy middle of the marsh. We'll rejoin the hunt right after this last message.
Hi, this is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
You want to be really careful when walking through this stuff.
Okay.
The tips of the stems are really sharp, and they could damage your eye if you fell in it. So if you do feel yourself falling into a hole, look up to get your eyes out of the way.
All right.
So good advice.
I'm about to follow David Curson of the Audubon's Mid-Atlantic chapter into a vast field of needle rush. And I've got to say, his advice is not great for my nerves. I'm following in his wake, stepping gingerly onto the lower part of the marsh stems, trying to avoid sinking into the earth and toppling face first into one of the many sharp ends of the chest-high spines. My fingertips aren't so lucky. I've cobbled together a helpful compilation of my misfortunes from my 6 hours in the marsh.
Ow. Yeah, that one got me. Ow. Damn it. Ow. Ow. Remember, Jeremy, if you fall, look up. Just peachy. Ow, ow, ow. Bitch. Needle rush. It's a lot of fun.
By about the 5th hour, I'm overheating. It's not quite 80 degrees, but the exertion and the rubber bodysuit have me feeling lightheaded and drained of energy. As a native Floridian, you'd think I'd know the signs of heat stroke, but this really crept up on me. Now that I'm listening to the tape again, I can hear my breathing getting labored. I'm yawning a lot, which I now know to be a symptom of your overheated brain trying to cool itself. I turn off the recorder and finally admit to Curson that I'm not feeling great. He produces an orange. I hate oranges. I practically inhale this orange. He gives me an apple. and I greedily eat that as well. He lends me some extra water. I gulp it down. Within about 15 minutes, I'm starting to feel like myself again. Kirsten doesn't look surprised. He always carries extra fruit and water when bringing out someone new to the marsh. This is just what happens. Right now, I'm feeling super impressed that the salt marsh sparrow, or any other kind of organism, can live in such conditions. It's no accident that they live here, Kirsten tells me.
For plants, birds, and other animals, it's species that have adapted to a fairly extreme environment that can live here. And so in doing so, in evolving to specialize in marshes, they kind of release themselves from competition with other species that would be much more intense in a kind of a nice lush forest.
When we reach the survey markers, Kirsten follows the same protocol each time. He listens for a few minutes and logs any bird species that he sees or hears.
Now, so that is a clapper rail, and the clapper rail is one of our secretive marsh birds.
You keep saying secretive.
Yeah, it's basically these are birds that spend most of their time hiding in the marsh.
Not all birds will just call out unbidden. For the next part of the survey, Kirsten's MP3 player begins playing calls of different marsh bird species over a speaker. What species is that supposed to be?
Black rail.
This goes on for one species after another. The least bitten. The song sparrow. This goes on for a few more birds until the speaker announces,
Stop.
And that's the end of the survey.
He does this at 3 locations at various points in the marsh. His survey partner, Christina Olsen with the Army Corps, does the same at 3 locations of her own. They encounter many birds over the course of their morning, but no salt marsh sparrows. Back in the parking lot, I ask Kirsten about it.
As you said, this is all low marsh, black needle rush. Not a good habitat for the salt marsh sparrow at all. And in fact, we didn't see any today. Are you disappointed?
Well, I mean, I already knew that at the project site we wouldn't have salt marsh sparrows because they don't use the needle rush habitat there. There's less and less of the high marsh salt hay that there used to be on the site. So I wasn't surprised.
That's the problem. The Chesapeake Bay is rising. The salt marsh sparrow's habitat is getting flooded more often. That's an issue because these birds build their nests under the grass in the high marsh. Unable to nest and raise their young properly, their numbers are plummeting.
The last time these sharp surveys were done, back in 2011-2012, the population, the global breeding population of salt marsh sparrow was estimated to be, I believe, 53,000. Between 53,000 and 60,000, which is already a very small number for a whole species. And those birds are spread between Maine and Virginia, so just breeding only in the northeast in the high marsh.
What little is left of that population is declining by about 9% a year, according to one study. At that rate, the salt marsh sparrow could be extinct by 2050. For now, though, the bird isn't on the endangered species list. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has given itself a 2023 deadline to decide whether that should happen, giving biologists and land managers time to try to protect the species, to take action, like raising the marsh on Deal Island.
Do you think once this project has been completed, they've raised the salt marsh, they've replanted it with the appropriate species, do you think that the sparrows will move back in?
Well, I certainly hope so, but one thing I should stress is that it will take several years.
As biologists learned at Poplar Island, a bay island reborn out of muck hauled in from shipping channels, it takes about 7 years for vegetation to be reestablished. and for the marsh birds to return, Kirsten says. As you're listening to this podcast, the Deal Island Restoration Project is just getting underway. The work is scheduled to be completed in 2022. Then we'll just have to wait and see if this bellwether bird returns. Thanks to Greenfin Studio, which combines creativity and communication savvy with scientific insight. Visit greenfinstudio.com to see how they can help your organization engage a wider audience. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at bayjournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.